Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our panel on equitable sustainability here at the conference to talk about building Louisiana's infrastructure beyond roads and bridges, and our plenary conversation today about investing in racial equity. My name is Takima Robinson. I am the founder and the CEO of Converge Consulting, and I also serve as the director of the Greater New Orleans Funders Network. And I am so excited to share this stage with some of my friends and colleagues in this work. So today we're going to be talking about this topic around investing and philanthropic investing, to be specific. As many of us know, New Orleans has been the beneficiary of lots and lots of philanthropic investment, particularly since Hurricane Katrina. But also before that, New Orleans was also a place that was drastically divested in by foundations and philanthropy. And today we are talking about and talking with some of the foremost leaders in our city and in our region and in our state who are working to move more resources to the front lines for the work of racial equity. So today, and coming to the stage, I am going to be talking with Chantel Rush, who is the Managing Director for American Cities with the Kresge Foundation. Deirdre Johnson Burel, Senior Program Officer at the WK Kellogg Foundation. Hey, Chantel. Andy Kopplin, President and CEO of the Greater New Orleans Foundation. Carmen James Randolph, Founding President and CEO of the Women's Foundation of the South. Hello, everybody. Hello.
Hello, hello.
All right, well, it is good. It's so good to be here with you to share the stage and the space. I know we all wish we could be there in person with each other like we used to at the Godolphin convenings. But I'm excited to have this conversation with our community about the work of philanthropy in our region. So just to kind of kick off and start the conversation, I'm going to start with you, Chantel, and just get you to talk a little bit about your work to set the stage before we really jump into some of our other questions. So Chantel, would you mind starting the conversation, talking a little bit about the work of the Kresge Foundation? Like many foundations, Kresge made some big investments and stepped up in a really big way, particularly in 2020, following George Floyd. Now, Kresge's been doing this work for years, has been on its own racial equity journey, but really moving into the racial justice space with the Racial Justice Fund, making increasingly large, sizable, multi-year general operating investments in organizations that are doing racial equity work in Louisiana. Can you talk about why it was important for Kresge to make this pivot and what this means for the foundation and its own journey in terms of funding racial equity and justice work?
Sure, thank you, Takima. I think for us, 2020, I think Black Lives Matter had really put on the collective consciousness of the country a focus on racial equity, that challenges that had always been there that people were starting to talk about more and more. And philanthropy was talking about it. Boy, were we talking about it. Equity, equity, equity. But for us, the question became like, are we who we say we are? We're talking about this a lot. Are we actually doing what we're saying? And could we really go harder around this? Could we work on this in a way that when we looked back years from now, we felt we did all that we could? So taking this moment for us was about really figuring out concrete actions that we could take to move beyond the rhetoric. And what was important, I think, in the fund that we created was that it gave us space to really focus. Number one, on moving beyond a focus on equity investments to a focus on justice investments. So actually removing barriers instead of folks operating within unjust systems gave us an opportunity to be rigid, saying we're going to support organizations that have proximate leadership. We're going to give them long-term general operating support. And it also gave us an opportunity to be expansive. So we're going to support, racial justice organizations that are working on the front lines. We also supported community-based initiatives. We also supported work on community economics and wealth building instead of kind of just historic programmatic investments. And then we also wanted to focus on systems change. So this was an opportunity for us, I think, to live by our values. And it's something that has been a great opportunity for us. And we are continuing to try to do this work better every day.
Thank you, Chantel. And we are so appreciative in the greater New Orleans area and all throughout Louisiana for the investments the Kresge Foundation is making in our communities. Next, I want to move it to Deirdre, and another national foundation that has really set up shop in New Orleans and made a generational commitment to this region. And so we want to talk a little bit about what do you see as some of the greatest opportunities? Kellogg has been a leader in the philanthropic community for many, many years on these issues around race and racial equity. What do you see as the greatest opportunities to increase racial equity in our communities? And why do you think the role of philanthropy is important? What does Kellogg learn from its years of doing this work about how we really invest in racial equity effectively in communities?
Yeah, thank you, Takima. I want to, before I dig into answering that question, just thank the Urban League for leading right out of the gate with this conversation about investing in equity. I think it's an important centering. I think it's important for us to talk about what philanthropy can do, absolutely. And I think it's an important piece to amplifying that this is really everybody's work. It is not sidebar work, it is anchor work, right? And so to your point, yes, the Kellogg Foundation has made a generational commitment to New Orleans. I'm certainly, as a native New Orleanian, excited and proud of that, the recognition that to do this kind of work, you got to go deep and you have to stay long. But I also want to take a little time to be super intentional in answering, being intentional and giving deep intention to answering the piece around racial equity and then what philanthropy can do. As you know, the foundation considers racial equity a part of its DNA, right? So what does that mean? It really means that for us, it's about more than just our grant making. It's in both the process of the work, so sort of what Chantel talked about, like it can't just be how we spend, how we invest, it also has to be about how we do the work. And we've taken a step back to really do a deep dive and clarify, what do we mean when we say, what is racial equity really? What is the work we're aiming to do? What are the problems we're aiming to solve? And so for us, we framed racial equity as an aspirational pursuit, insisting that all people, regardless of their racial and ethnic identity, have equal opportunity. What we recognize is that the social construct of race has been used to sustain a false hierarchy of human value that ultimately privileges whiteness and determines access to resources, including ours, right? And so for racial equity to be achieved, we really have to work to undo that, to be really intentional about that. So that is absolutely systems transformation work, but it's also racial healing work, right? So again, that inside, outside part of the work. And while there's a social justice imperative that I think the past 2 years have absolutely amplified, just like CEOs Morse opened up, it's an economic imperative. We don't know really the full capability of what this country is able to achieve because we've never harnessed the full ability of the full population. And so what we've seen is that we, in 2018, the foundation invested in the business case for racial equity. And that really amplified that by 2050, we could see an economic gain of $43 billion in New Orleans alone if we actually grant access to BIPOC-led organizations, and if we remove those economic disparities. So again, that's everybody's work. And so why is philanthropy important in that? I think philanthropy at its best, because we do good, and unfortunately sometimes we've done harm. But at its best, philanthropic organizations can serve as a catalyst and a conduit for change. We can get proximate to the problem, working in concert with our community partners. We can learn those issues deeply, and we can invest in amplifying them. And I think that that's some of what we've seen from philanthropy in the past couple of years. But again, what we can also do is show what that looks like in our work. So like Chantel amplified in there, where we've really looked inside our organization to say, okay, what does that look like for staff diversity? So it's one thing to say we need diverse folks at the table. What does that look like? And so we've really doubled down in that space, but we've also doubled down on looking at the investment side. So the foundation really has taken a look at investing our endowment with minority-led entities, right? So we've invested over 160 million in underrepresented managers. We feel like this time we can amplify both, like, hey, we can support the work, the power building work in our grant making, but we can also be a part of building that critical infrastructure.
Absolutely. Deirdre, I thank you for that. Thank you for really nuancing and illuminating all the ways in which institutions who are foundations can be doing racial equity work and expressing that, investing in it, but also using their own voice as well as their internal resources to move the needle on racial equity as well. Andy, I want to come to you as our hometown foundation here in New Orleans. Can you talk a little bit about the racial equity journey that GNOF has been on, the Greater New Orleans Foundation, as well as talk about what you all are learning about how better to support communities who want to do racial equity work?
Sure, and good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Takima, and it's an honor to be on this panel with such distinguished women leaders in our field, and I'm proud to know all of them and call them all friends. We've partnered, of course, with the Kresge Foundation on a lot of our civic leadership projects and our workforce programming and our nonprofit capacity building, with the Kellogg Foundation on economic opportunity, workforce, as well as catalyzing community change and diversifying our fund holder base. I'm proud, especially this morning, to precede my former colleague, our Vice President of Programs, Carmen James Randolph, who really, as a leader of our programs team, directed some of the work that you asked about, Takima. So in 2018, the foundation had long been investing in communities of color through our foundation-directed grant making that our board sees, largely because our theories of change for our own grant making were designed by Carmen and our grants committee, and really focused on addressing disparities. And so we did that work. We did it quietly, we did it thoroughly, but we didn't do it vocally. And in 2018, we added equity as a strategic priority to our strategic framework. And it was the first time we'd actually ever called out equity as a value of the foundation. We've been doing the work again, as I said, quietly. And then, of course, 2020 called all of us to purpose. And I remember just the horror of George Floyd's killing and trying to figure out what our response was. And I was busy working on statements. And my colleagues on the foundation said, yeah, the statement's great, Andy, but that's not enough. Not now, not this moment. And Carmen was one of those leaders who said that. And the question was, what does a community foundation like ours do when we really care about something? When Katrina happens, we raised a fund. When the BP oil spill happens, we raised a fund. When the tornadoes in New Orleans East or the floods in Baton Rouge occurred, we raised a fund. And so when George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many others are calling us to purpose, what should we do at the foundation, which is that we should raise a fund and name it. And so we started the Greater Together Fund for Racial Equity. Our board really engaged in it and made a commitment. The first financial commitment was from our own organization. And we, for the first time ever, said we're going to prioritize funding Black-led organizations and funding organizations who are working, as Chantel earlier described, not just to fight within the system, but to fix unjust systems. So ending institutional racism was a key priority of that fund. supporting grassroots organizations that are on the front lines of fighting those unfair systems? And then what can we do to build wealth for the African-American community through entrepreneurship, workforce, housing programs? And so we launched that fund in September of 2020 with a commitment to raise $3 million and invest $3 million over 3 years, and then to make sustained general operating support grants, which again, is something that I learned from Carmen and from my colleagues on this panel, Takima, from you through the Greater New Orleans Funders Network, and again, this group, about how to invest in sustainable ways in organizations that have not been able to adequately garner the resources they deserve to do the good work that we're doing, to do the good work that they're doing. And so we're proud to be on this journey. We've got a lot to learn. We've learned a lot in recent years, and I'm blessed to have the colleagues on this panel who have helped me in my own personal journey, and then again in our board in transforming the work that we do in the community.
Thank you, Andy. So Carmen, we come to you, our newest foundation on the block, and so excited about the work that you're doing with the Women's Foundation on the South. Can you talk a little bit about why we need a Women's Foundation of the South and what role it will have in moving the needle on racial equity?
Great. Good morning, Takima. Good morning to all of my esteemed colleagues, and thank you to the Urban League for inviting us to be a part of this panel. As we know, women of color are most affected by inequity at the intersection of multiple systems of oppression, and their work is continually under-resourced, especially in the South. And under-resourcing women of color leaders and entrepreneurs keeps the South, and we believe indeed America, from achieving its highest vision and promise for our future. The Women's Foundation of the South is the first foundation dedicated to women and girls of color across 13 states, led by proven and successful grant-making experts who are also women of color. WFS is committed to building the health, wealth, and power of women and girls of color in the South. We launched an ambitious $100 million fundraising initiative to make this a permanent inheritance for women and girls of color in the South that will address immediate needs for BIPOC women in the South, while also focusing on longer-term systemic change where opportunities to address gender and racial injustice are high, but philanthropic support is low. So at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, while it was wreaking havoc on BIPOC communities, we realized that the impact of women on women at the intersectionality of this racial reckoning that was happening in American society called for there to be no better time to launch the Women's Foundation of the South, to be a conscious collaborator to reimagine philanthropic investment in community in the way that we understand that it's so desperately needed. So this is actually, it has been a radical act to create this foundation, to create it with the intention of building it from collective power of women. And to do so, we started by bringing together not only our founders who've come from foundations from across the South, but a fabulous kitchen cabinet of women, including yourself, Takima, who were diverse, everything from trans women organizers to queer women and Muslim women, our Latina sisters, to vision what this work should look like and what it should be. So Deirdre, you referred to an inside and outside game. This is a tremendous opportunity for us to reimagine philanthropy. The work that you all have spoke about is a tremendous labor, as you all know. Andy and Chantel and Deirdre, the work and labor that it takes to turn boards around, to bring leadership forward, to bring your staff forward, to get the right people in the right seats, to advance equity, to think boldly and to act boldly. We have the opportunity to do that from the very start. We have the opportunity to build this foundation with all of those elements in place, and with a strong edict from our board to embed our values internally in every part of the organization, as well as externally. So we opened our doors in August of 2021, and in just 8 short months, we've leveraged more than $3 million of support from donors from across the country. And I must say, our first $100,000 came from Black women working in philanthropy, leveraging their own treasure, giving out of their own pockets to make this happen, and then leveraging their own institutions, and then joined by larger gifts from philanthropy, including from Casey Family Programs, the Kellogg Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, the Advocacy Foundation, and many others. And we were just blessed to receive a commitment from Pivotal. So we're very excited about this momentum that we're on and that we've gathered. And in 2021, we had the opportunity to make our first round of grants, awarding nearly $200,000 to leaders here in Louisiana, starting here at home, and investing in the health and restoration of women of color leaders who have been leading in a disaster and through another disaster. So for us, understanding, it's one thing to say that women of color led nonprofits are the most or the least resourced nonprofits, but it's another to understand what that means and to understand the cost that our leaders bear for doing this work with so little resources. And also what that means. So anyway, we are thrilled to be a part of this panel and to be doing this work and to be launching our work here at home and expanding in this year to Mississippi and Arkansas.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to continue our conversation. And so also feel free to come off mic and jump in. We are all friends. We do this often. And folks are really witnessing our conversation. So also feel free to jump in on other folks' comments. So this can be a little more conversation. I did want to double back on something I heard in all of your conversation and thinking about our audience out there, right? We talk to each other all the time. We talk in philanthropies, but today we get to share the work that we do and the things that we hold dearly and think about with our colleagues in the field. And so can we talk a little bit about why does money matter and why does supporting BIPOC leaders with resources matter? So we're talking about investing in racial equity. One of the things that we have learned, and you cited this in the report that you were referencing, Deirdre, about the lack of resources going to BIPOC leaders. Why is it critical, Deirdre, that we support BIPOC leaders as we invest in racial equity? Why is it important that we prioritize them?
Yep. I think one, we know that they've been underinvested in. And so they typically, there's that old saying, my grandmother said, you're trying to make $1 out of 15 cents. Well, BIPOC leaders that is the legacy for good and for not, of taking some of the best leveraged dollars, the dollars that have gone the furthest, have been those dollars invested in BIPOC-led organizations because they are proximate to the problem. They understand intimately what the barriers are facing communities, right? And so they are able to implement quickly strategies that impact community in additive ways, right? So the return in terms of the work is often significant, but we have philanthropically and otherwise underinvested in them historically. Those disparities and those gaps have real significant implications for the change they're working to create in the world. And we have to be, and in the country, let me just be, and in our city, to be explicit. And so we have to be as strategic and tactical to really right-size that, right? So we really want to be able to, and so I'll use a really concrete example. So one of the things that often happens is that when those organizations have been underinvested in, they can't quite make the milestone for like eligibility for funding, right? So it's like, oh, they don't have the capacity, they can't quite, right? But that is systematic. That has happened in a really system. It's the result of that underinvestment. And so to begin to get them to scale, to be able to take that work to the next level, we have to be able to make those investments in BIPOC leaders so that their organizations are able to work at the same level as their majority-led institutions.
Thanks, Deirdre, for illuminating that. So let's talk a little bit about some of the other things we're learning for the audience, right? About best practices for funding racial equity and how we're showing up around this. Chantel, can you talk a little bit about what you learned out of your racial justice fund and how that's changing Kresge's practice going forward?
Sure. First, if I could just maybe add something to Deirdre's comment, which is I think it's very easy in a lot of organizations and offices and philanthropies, no matter what sector you're in, is to like pathologize like BIPOC-led orgs, you know, like, oh, it's a smaller organization, or, oh, it hasn't been. We are a national foundation. We spend $140 million of grants a year. And off the top, we choose to invest first in people of color and in cities like New Orleans, because this is not like a small off the table thing. People are serious. They're at these tables. They're doing the work every day. And for instance, when we're looking at the implementation of the Infrastructure Act, or we're looking at how ARP funds are used in communities, it's BIPOC leaders and their organizations that are at the table actually needing to call for the infrastructure interventions that their communities are asking for at the state level. So I just want us to like, you know, also hold that, right, that this is like a big critical piece. It's not like the, you know, nice to do thing. But in terms of Kresge, what we're learning, I mean, I think, look, a few years ago, there was a narrative in our organization that older folks who'd been around the block didn't really get the importance of investing in racial equity. So we had to do some internal work around that. The truth was, when we sat down with our board and we sat down with our executive team, there were a lot of people who really did understand and had lived with this stuff longer in their lives, right, than some of our newer grant makers had. So there was a lot of internal work around what are we on the same page about? What do we really believe? And like, what do we need to talk about explicitly to do this? So there's that internal piece. I think in terms of how you structure this work, like 5 years ago, I would have told you it doesn't make at all sense to have a separate sidecar fund. I would have been like, oh, that's insane. This is the work every day. What I've learned, I think, is doing both at once is really important, because you do need that space to like speak as plainly as possible, to push the boundaries as far as you can while you are shifting that whole, and you must do both. And then finally, like, I think we can't, that's kind of the internal, that's the structure. I think externally, what we're learning is there's just a lot of linkages between this work. You know, there are folks who are working every day at the block level, the neighborhood level, the citywide level, the region, across the regions, across the state, and national organizations that support those. And so we as philanthropy can be a little bit smarter and better about figuring out like, what are all the organizations we need to support at the different levels, and how do we actually coordinate around ensuring all those organizations are resourced, and especially focused on funding those that have a North Star around racial justice, as opposed to just like doing all of this because we feel like in general, right, we need to move policy forward.
Absolutely. So the policy focus within a context of racial equity. Andy, can you talk a little bit about what you all are learning and how you're applying that at the Greater New Orleans Foundation?
Yeah, thank you. And we've done a couple studies. We often do what we call the state of the sector in looking at nonprofits. And so we did two in the last 2 years. We did one kind of midway through 2020, right after the pandemic had hit. And then we did a follow-up study that we released at the end of 2021 that looked at, again, how nonprofits were adapting to life in the COVID pandemic, but also looking at the racial equity implications of their work. So we looked for the first time at the leadership of the boards and executive directors of those nonprofits. And we looked through our study partners at UNO at the organization's 990s to see how they did financially. And in fact, no surprise to any of us, I think this gets to the point Chantel just made. We know in our investments that there's a racial disparity in every single area that we work. That's what the Urban League conference is all about, highlighting and then making plans to address. We know there are lots of wonderful organizations doing really good work in authentic ways that are supporting those communities, and that may not be BIPOC led. But to make sure that we're making the kind of impact that we want to see in those communities, we need to do both. And so our traditional grant making program has a racial equity lens, but it doesn't have a limitation like our Greater Together Fund for Racial Equity does, where we wanted to make a statement and make those investments in BIPOC-led organizations, particularly Black-led organizations. And no surprise to any of us, our survey showed that Black-led organizations and BIPOC-led organizations in our region typically don't have endowments. If they have a reserve fund, the reserve fund is smaller. The base operating budgets for those organizations is smaller than white-led organizations. One of the most exciting findings in that study, though, showed that those Black-led organizations working in human services post-pandemic actually saw meaningful increases in their funding, whether they were able to raise more money because people were setting up funds like ours, or whether they were able to raise more money because we know that COVID had a disproportionate impact on communities of color. Folks were putting money into those organizations in ways that they hadn't done before. And so that was something thrilling to see. It was something meaningful to see. And it's something that we've got to make sure continues, because we can't just have this be a one-time effort if we're going to create the kind of equity and end the disparities that we want. And so that's where, again, our grant making on kind of a long-term general operating support, we're now having this conversation. We've given out $2.45 million towards our $3 billion goal. But we know as an organization that it can't just be one-time Greater Together Fund for Racial Equity. We've got to do this on the long term. And so the conversations we're having now are really about sustaining this particular effort. And so I hope that gives you a little glimpse as to the things that we've learned. The interesting thing I didn't say is, not surprisingly as well, the organizations that struggled the most in the last 2 years were organizations that were arts and culture organizations. Oftentimes because they couldn't host plays, performances, concerts, the things they do to raise money. Those are also the least diverse organizations in our nonprofit ecosystem. So there's fewer Black leaders in the arts and culture organizations. The boards are less diverse. So we also were able to pinpoint an area where those organizations need to adjust their own organizational priorities so that they can better serve our community.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it also speaks to the fact that oftentimes the Black arts and culture community in Louisiana or New Orleans is not necessarily incorporated in the same type of way, right? Structure also matters. So Carmen, talk a little bit about how you're carrying some of the wisdom that you're gleaning from the field on best practices on supporting racial equity and racial justice into the kind of work that you're doing at the Women's Foundation in the South. You all recently launched a campaign around rest. Can you talk to us about that and about why is that racial equity work?
Yes. So we, in terms of gleaning from lessons from the field, we are in building mode. So we are in the process of building the foundation, and we want to do so by listening to the people who we intend to serve, developing our grant-making strategies based on what they say they need, where they say the gaps are, the opportunities are, and where the strategic places are for investment. So to do this listening, we didn't want to be extractive. So this is the equity part. So inviting them to come together to listen and to learn from them, we wanted to give those leaders the opportunity to be poured into. We wanted to compensate them or support their time and their effort to come together and to listen. So we launched this initiative. It's a play on words called Woke at Rest, Women of Color at Rest. And that initiative builds first capacity of the leaders. So looking at leadership development, we have some leaders who said, I wish I knew how to rest. And understanding that as leaders, and this is all of us, we are not operating at our full power if we are not well, and if we are not rested, if we are not taking that time away from the work to come back to it with vision and passion and creativity. And this is the place, especially women of color, we've been conditioned to just keep working and working and working and not take those opportunities to rest. So we have given them support to enable them to do that. It's our hope that we can also provide general operating support to these groups, but bringing them together, we brought about 27 leaders together in New Orleans from across the state, and we gave them about a day and a half retreat opportunity to not only rest, but to network and to share their stories and to hear from them. And from that process, we got a full view into what the cost is for doing this work when women leaders are not taking the time to invest in their own well-being and doing the work and what they're up against. So I just want to also kind of build on something that both Deirdre and Chantel mentioned in terms of what does this underinvestment look like and why is it important to invest more mightily in these leaders. For instance, our Power Coalition in the state of Louisiana has been working hard to mobilize communities across the state and looking at this issue of redistricting, which is an important issue that not only impacts us, but this impacts the next generation for how policy and the impact of policy and law in our state. And the leader of the organization told me they had $40,000 available to invest in the communications effort for this campaign. And they learned that their opposition had invested $250,000. So when we ask what's at what's at stake here, and why do these leaders need to be invested in? They're working on systemic issues at the root level. They're doing yeoman's work. They are severely under-resourced. And let's be clear, their opposition, not only their white counterparts, but their opposition to creating the change that we know we need to see in the South is mightily resourced and fighting them on a level that they cannot compete if we are going to keep them as severely resourced as they've been.
Thank you, Carmen. I think that is so important. And the next thing I want to talk a little bit about how we are all learning as a field and as colleagues, right, to adapt our practice. One of the things I think we all learned post-Katrina is that we needed to better coordinate amongst ourselves as philanthropy. And so out of that, with the support of your institutions and each one of you as individual leaders, we collectively built the Greater New Orleans Funders Network. And we did that in response to what we were hearing from folks in the field asking us to better coordinate, but also because each one of our institutions and each one of us as leaders were on this racial equity to racial justice journey. And we needed a space where we could learn in real time together. So I want to lift that work up because I think it really demonstrates the commitment that all of our institutions have had to work better on behalf of community. But one of the things that we talk about in Godolphin is two things. What can we do together we can't do by ourselves? Right? It's a question we often ask our grantees, but what can we as philanthropy do together we can't do by ourselves? And one of the things that have come out of that question is we can put not only our money where our mouth is, but our mouth where our money is. And Andy has heard me say that 1,000 times as I asked him to jump on radio shows and television and write op-eds for us. But it's really important that we put our point of view, especially when it comes to racial equity and racial justice out there in the world. And we use our institutions and the bully pulpit of philanthropy as well. So can you all talk about that and really using the voice of your foundation? I'm going to start with you, Andy, on issues of racial equity and racial justice. So beyond the check, how is Godolphin showing up on these issues?
Thanks, Takima. And I think that it's a important point for us to be not just seen, but also heard. Not just to fund, but also to speak out. And so one of the things I think our board thought was the most important as we were starting the Greater Together Fund for Racial Equity was to make sure that our words were clear. And so we wanted to make sure that we weren't just setting up a racial equity fund without having it be directed to Black leaders. We wanted to say that we were taking on institutional racism. We wanted to make sure that when there are conversations like this, that we're part of those conversations. When we did the survey, we made an intentional choice to ask questions about racial equity, many of the same questions, in fact, that our funders from Kresge and Kellogg, and I'm sure, no doubt, Carmen is doing this with the Women's Foundation of the South, asking questions about the identity of our board, asking questions about the identity of our leadership, to make sure that the organizations that we're funding know that these things are important. And when the Greater New Orleans Foundation says, we think these are important, we hope that the whole sector says, A, we better listen, but also B, we ought to model that example that they're using at the Greater New Orleans Foundation. Because if we're going to truly create in our words, a vibrant, sustainable, and just region for all, then these are the things that we've got to do to address those disparities that leave it an unjust, unvibrant, unsustainable world and region for too many of our immediate neighbors. And so again, this is why this work is so important. I was listening to what Carmen was saying about the Power Coalition. I think one of the interesting things we did, the first 3 investments we made were in the Urban League, who's sponsoring today's conference, the Power Coalition, working again to change unjust systems, and then in Go B, which supports minority entrepreneurs to develop wealth, to help build those resources, to give African American small business leaders the tools that they need to be able to build wealth, to build generational wealth, and to be able to sustain the kind of investments that they want to make in their community.
Awesome. Deirdre, Carmen, y'all want to talk a little bit about the advocacy power of philanthropy or also your work to fund advocacy work? Anybody? All right.
Here I come. It took me a second to get off mute. I do want to co-sign what has been shared and underline that this piece about the importance of investing in BIPOC-led, but that it's not a zero sum. Everyone wins when we make these types of investments, right? Our state is significantly improved. It's akin to sort of curb cuts, right? We having a more just systems works for everyone. So Power Coalition and the work that they've done with redistricting, the work that has happened via Converge, talk about being together around criminal justice reform, and fair juries, right? Like those things are really the direct result of investing in BIPOC leaders. But I think it's also important to strategically come alongside our partners, like to follow their lead, right? Because those most close to the problem are really the experts, right? So, but to come alongside and say, if we with you, we with you. And that means bringing our advocacy voice. So what does that, what does that look like, right? I think Ganafin has been an incredible space for us to do that together in aggregate. So whether it's around issues of educational equity and the key issues that we're dealing with there, whether it's around equitable access, right? Whether it's around climate justice, I think the importance of us really coming alongside to lend our voice, whether it's op-eds, whether it's investments, but really coming alongside to say, yes, we are in it with you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Well, I know we are, go ahead, Andy, jump in.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to jump in. I thought, Deirdre, you made an excellent point about trying to explain, how equity investments benefit everyone. One of the things we've been talking about is with climate change, tree planting in New Orleans needs to be done everywhere. But the biggest impact will be in the lowest income communities of color where the tree canopy has been decimated the most. And if we can plant lots of trees in those communities, we can, improve the quality of life in those communities, but also reduce the urban heat island effect that something that benefits the whole community. I think, we're facing lots of challenges talking about whether or not these investments are appropriate. And I think having, both two ways to talk about it. Here's why they're directly important for those communities of color, but here's why everyone benefits when we have a more equitable and just community. And I think that that's a really important message that we should share as well.
Absolutely, Andy. I appreciate that. Putting a fine pin because it's not a zero-sum game. Racial equity is really the tide that lifts all boats. But not everyone we have to talk about it in a way that folks can experience it in that way. So as we get ready to close, I do want to do a last round for everyone. And I love to end all panels talking about possibility and what is possible. And so, Carmen, you reminded us of the title of last year's convening, which was Reimagining Philanthropy. And so many things are possible, especially as we emerge from this pandemic, are possible 2 years that were not possible 2 years ago. So based on all that we know and all that we have tried and failed and learned from, what do we think is now possible for our field and for our community? And so I'd love to come around to each one of you and have you talk a little bit about the possibility for this community and for how philanthropy can show up to better resource racial equity throughout the state of Louisiana. So I'll start with you, Chantel. As far as the Kresge Foundation's investments in this area, what do you think is sort of the next phase of that work, and what do you think is possible?
I think Deirdre's point that numbers matter is really important. So, right now, out of our $30 million fund, we invested $5 million in Louisiana. Every year, our grant making is at a certain level. I think for us and for philanthropy in general, like watching those numbers, like how much of your dollars are going to BIPOC-led organizations, how many of your dollars are going to organizations that are advancing racial equity, whether it's from a policy perspective or an organizing perspective, keeping hard track of that, I think is really, really important. I also think right now, we're looking across the country at both the American Rescue Plan dollars and the Infrastructure Act dollars. And there are communities, Michigan, state of Michigan being one of them, that are setting up statewide equity funds to actually provide technical assistance, support, convening, and advocacy to organizations who are trying to influence those funds or deploy those funds. And I think there's a moment for philanthropy and all of us who have both that voice we can use, right, and also that funding that we can provide to organizations to really figure out how in this moment we can support that work, both around American Rescue Plan and the Infrastructure Act. We know half of those opportunities are competitive, half of them are formula driven. Those dollars, if they do not advance racial equity, that is a complete miss. So I think we really need to get together and coordinate and figure out how to get that done. And there are examples of that in other states and other communities.
Thank you. All right, Deirdre, your thoughts on what is possible and what are the next steps for the Kellogg Foundation and the state?
I do want to co-sign. I'm over here a little bobbleheadish with Chantel talking, but I do want to co-sign what she has lifted up in terms of ARPA, the American Rescue Plan, and this is an incredible, the infusion of resources that our state has seen, that it's a significant infusion, and there is significant opportunity for us to really deploy those resources in ways that can transform more equitable systems in health, that we have more community responsive, more responsive systems locally and at the state levels. I think we have to, ARPA and the infrastructure bill are themselves both an opportunity to be a conduit and a catalyst. At a policy conference, I just have to say that, like, while we're talking about philanthropy, everything that we're doing is also possible in the public sector, right? And so racial equity is not just about the policy outcome, but about the government process, right? So who's in the contracting line, how we're reflecting diversity and racial equity in our partnerships inside state agencies and listening to community voice. All of those things, right, are as important in the public system. In fact, and so we want to come alongside public sector, right along with you, and share these lessons so that the end that we're interested in is the same, right? Transformative communities. I had to add that little piece.
No, I love all of these points. What is possible if we collaborate with our public sector partners? Andy, what is possible?
I think for us, we started looking at, again, the diversity and the grant making that we do with our board's self-directed funds. And so it's about how do we sustain that. But the other conversation is that we have a lot of donor advised funds, and those are directed by the individual fund holders. And we pride ourselves on introducing our fund holders to interesting organizations who are doing great work. And when we come up with a survey focusing on, the racial equity gaps in leadership and funding in our sector, I'm hoping, and we're going to start being able to track whether or not some of our fund holders are making different choices in their grant making. It's part of our work. And so I'd like to see both. I think that we can inspire folks to follow this path to really making investments that make a difference for all, because we're investing in racial equity.
Awesome, thank you so much. And Carmen, last but not least, and the newest, the newbie, can you talk a little bit? So the world is so open to the Women's Foundation of the South in terms of what is possible as you start this new philanthropic institution. Talk a little bit about the vision and how you all imagine the possibilities in front of you.
Well, first, I want to say that we think it is possible to change the economic paradigm in this country and to lift and change the economic trajectory of 2.5 million women. We believe that when women are well, their children are well. When their children are well, the communities are well. And when the community is well, we all are well. And we understand that women of color truly are the critical linchpin in our communities. So we think that in terms of what's possible in our vision, we have a vision to write a new narrative about who women of color and girls of color are in the South, to lift the issues, to be that bold voice that many of our colleagues, like for instance, as we have been building relationships with our sister foundations across the South, they said to us, we need you to be able to say the things that we can't say, or to be able to leverage investment to push the work that we need to have done. So we want to be that source, that critical partner for donors, for philanthropy, especially at this moment where we have so much on the line in terms of reproductive justice, voting rights, climate change. There are so many critical issues, and we've seen also in the last 2 years the incredible way that coalitions of women of color have changed, legislation in this country, have moved forward candidates in this country, and they're doing that all on a shoestring. So we have to ask, what is possible if they have more, if they have the resources that they need to truly realize their destinies and determine their futures and to thrive. And that's what we are about, is we see the possibility of women and girls thriving and believe firmly that when we thrive, we all do well.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank the Urban League, the board and the staff of the Urban League for bringing us all together and allowing us as colleagues who work in philanthropy, who work to resource the nonprofits in the state of Louisiana, to share with you the work that we are all doing on racial equity. Thank you so much for having us here. I hope you all learned a lot about the foundations in your state who are working tirelessly on your behalf, and these amazing leaders. I am constantly learning from you, and I'm so excited about the work that you continue to do and how you are advancing those possibilities. Thank you all for who you are, and I hope everyone has an amazing rest of the conference. And again, thank you to the Urban League for allowing us to be here on the stage and to share with you. Have an amazing day, everyone.